Deep in the Carpathian wilderness, where ancient pines swallow sunlight and silence reigns supreme, PETROV stumbles upon something that should not exist. A massive Soviet radio mast pierces the forest canopy like a steel monument to forgotten wars. The tower stands 40 meters tall, its rusted framework telling stories of decades abandoned to weather and time. Alex approaches the crumbling concrete bunker at its base. Inside, dust particles dance in shafts of light filtering through cracked walls. Banks of vintage radio equipment line the room. Dials, switches and gauges from an era when the world balanced on the edge of nuclear destruction. Most of the machinery sits dead and cold, but one console hums with faint electrical life. A signal log lies open beside it, entries written in Cyrillic script. Alex's blood runs cold as he reads the dates. The most recent entry was logged just 3 days ago, but who could still be operating this forgotten Cold War relic? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Alex's hands trembled as he picked up the signal log. The leather-bound book felt heavy with secrets, its pages yellowed and brittle at the edges. Each entry was meticulously recorded in neat Cyrillic handwriting, documenting transmissions that spanned decades. The most recent entries showed activity patterns that suggested someone had been maintaining regular contact with the outside world. The concrete bunker extended deeper than Alex had initially realized. Beyond the main control room, a narrow corridor led to additional chambers carved into the hillside. Emergency lighting flickered to life as motion sensors detected his movement, illuminating walls lined with cables and ventilation, ducts that hummed with barely audible electrical current. The first room he discovered contained sleeping quarters, a simple military cot with olive drab blankets, a small table, and a wooden chair that had seen decades of use. Personal items were arranged with military precision, a straight razor, a ceramic mug, and a stack of books in Russian. The air smelled of tobacco and machine oil, with an underlying mustiness that spoke of long isolation. In the corner, Alex found an operator's manual bound in red leather, its cover embossed with the hammer and sickle. The pages were filled with technical diagrams, frequency charts, and operational procedures written in the methodical style of Soviet documentation. As he flipped through the manual, his rudimentary knowledge of Russian allowed him to piece together fragments of meaning. This was no ordinary communication station. The manual referred to Special Operation Nightingale 7, a designation that appeared repeatedly throughout the documentation. Frequency allocations covered international bands, and transmission protocols suggested capabilities far beyond simple radio communication. This facility had been designed for long-range, encrypted communications across multiple continents. Alex moved to the next chamber, where he discovered the true scope of the installation. Banks of equipment lined every wall, their vacuum tubes glowing amber in the dim light. Massive transformers hummed with electrical power, while cooling fans circulated air through ventilation systems that must have been installed decades ago. Everything was clean, dust-free, and obviously maintained. The equipment itself was a historian's dream, Soviet-era radio transmitters and receivers that represented the pinnacle of 1960s technology. Frequency synthesizers, antenna tuning units and signal processors filled rack after rack of precisely organized electronics. Despite their age, every piece of equipment appeared to be in perfect working condition. What disturbed Alex most was the evidence of recent use. Coffee stains on the operator's desk were fresh, and a half-eaten meal sat on a tray nearby. Whoever operated this station had been here recently, possibly within hours of Alex's arrival. The realization sent ice through his veins as he considered the implications. He found a logbook detailing maintenance activities spanning 4 decades. The handwriting changed over time, suggesting multiple operators, but the most recent entries were all in the same careful script. Replacement parts had been acquired, systems upgraded, and operational procedures updated to maintain compatibility with modern communication standards. The station's code name, Nightingale 7, appeared in transmission logs that documented regular contact with locations across Eastern Europe, Asia, and even North America. Coordinate references suggested a network of similar installations, each maintaining their vigil long after the Cold War had officially ended. Alex discovered a map mounted behind protective glass, showing the locations of other stations in the network. Red pins marked active sites, while black pins indicated installations that had gone silent over the years. Too many black pins for comfort, and a pattern that suggested systematic elimination rather than natural degradation. In a locked cabinet that had been left open, Alex found documentation that made his blood run cold. Personnel files, mission briefings, and operational orders that referenced ongoing activities well into the current decade. This wasn't an abandoned relic, it was an active military installation, maintained by someone with access to current intelligence and operational directives. The most chilling discovery was a photograph tucked into the personnel file. It showed a man in Soviet military uniform standing beside the very equipment Alex now examined. The face was weathered but unmistakably competent, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority and isolation. A name was written on the back, Viktor Kozlov, Station Commander. As Alex studied the photograph, footsteps echoed from the entrance corridor. Someone was approaching the bunker, and Alex realized with growing panic that he had nowhere to hide. The footsteps were measured, deliberate, suggesting someone who knew every inch of this underground facility. He quickly replaced the photograph and moved toward the deepest chamber, hoping to find another exit. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the sound of equipment being activated. Whoever had arrived was settling in for another shift at the radio station that officially didn't exist. Alex pressed himself against the cold concrete wall of the deepest chamber, listening as the footsteps grew closer. His heart hammered against his ribs as he heard the distinctive sound of switches being thrown and equipment powering up. The electrical hum that filled the bunker intensified, suggesting someone was preparing the station for operation. Through a crack in the doorway, Alex watched as a figure moved efficiently through the control room. The man appeared to be in his 70s, with silver hair and the deliberate movements of someone who had performed these same actions thousands of times. Despite his age, he moved with military precision, checking each piece of equipment in a predetermined sequence. This had to be Viktor Kozlov. Alex remained hidden while Viktor began his operational routine. The old man consulted a thick binder filled with frequency charts and transmission schedules, his finger tracing columns of numbers and timestamps. Every few minutes, he would adjust dials on the transmitter, fine-tuning frequencies with the expertise of a master craftsman. The encrypted frequency chart that Viktor referenced was unlike anything Alex had seen. Standard radio frequencies were marked, but overlay sheets showed additional channels designated with Cyrillic letters and numerical codes. Some frequencies were marked with red ink, suggesting priority or emergency status. Others had been crossed out entirely, with dates noting when those channels had gone silent. Viktor pulled out a worn notebook and began making entries in the same careful handwriting Alex had seen in the logbooks. Each entry included precise timestamps, atmospheric conditions, and transmission parameters. The level of detail suggested someone maintaining contact with a sophisticated network that required exact timing and technical precision. As Viktor worked, Alex noticed a pattern in the transmission schedule. Communications occurred every 72 hours. Always during specific atmospheric conditions that would optimize signal propagation over vast distances. The next transmission window was scheduled for tomorrow evening during a predicted atmospheric disturbance that would allow signals to bounce off the ionosphere with unusual efficiency. The frequency chart revealed the true scope of the network. Primary frequencies connected Nightingale 7 to stations across the former Soviet Union, while secondary channels reached into Western Europe, Asia, and even North America. Codenames like Blackbird, Swan, and Raven marked different network nodes, each representing a hidden installation similar to this one. Victor's preparation ritual was methodical and thorough. He tested each piece of equipment, calibrated signal levels, and verified encryption systems that had been designed during the height of the Cold War. Despite the equipment's age, everything functioned with the reliability of precision engineering maintained through decades of careful attention. What fascinated Alex was how Victor had adapted the vintage equipment to work with modern communication standards. Software-defined radio modules had been integrated with the original hardware, allowing the station to communicate using contemporary encryption while maintaining compatibility with older network nodes. This wasn't just preservation, it was active modernization of a Cold War communication system. The transmission protocols Victor followed were complex, beyond anything civilian radio operators would use. Multiple frequency changes during each session, time-synchronized encryption key rotations, and signal masking techniques that would make the transmissions nearly impossible to detect without specialized equipment. This was military-grade communications designed to remain hidden from the most sophisticated surveillance systems. Alex watched Victor pull out a sealed packet marked with today's date. Inside were printed sheets containing what appeared to be numerical codes arranged in precise columns. These were clearly one-time encryption keys, printed in advance and synchronized across the entire network. Using such keys would make the transmissions mathematically unbreakable without the corresponding cipher sheets. The atmospheric monitoring equipment that Victor consulted showed real-time ionospheric conditions across the northern hemisphere. Signal propagation models indicated optimal transmission windows, when atmospheric disturbances would allow communications to reach maximum distance while remaining hidden within natural radio noise. Tomorrow's predicted solar storm activity would provide perfect cover for long-range communications. Victor's notebook contained transmission logs dating back 40 years, with entries showing regular contact with dozens of network nodes. Recent entries, however, showed a disturbing pattern. Many call signs had been marked with red X's, indicating stations that had stopped responding. Over the past 5 years, the network had shrunk from 37 active nodes to fewer than a dozen. As Victor completed his equipment checks, he paused at a secure communication terminal that Alex hadn't noticed before. Modern satellite communication equipment had been integrated with the vintage radio systems, providing backup communication channels that couldn't be disrupted by atmospheric conditions or detected by traditional radio monitoring. Victor entered a complex authorization code and accessed what appeared to be encrypted message traffic. His expression grew increasingly grim as he read through recent communications. Something was clearly wrong within the network, and tomorrow's transmission would apparently address whatever crisis was developing. The old operator finally settled into his chair and began monitoring international radio traffic, listening for signals that would indicate whether other network nodes were still operational. His practiced ear could apparently distinguish between routine radio traffic and the subtle signs that would indicate his fellow operators were still maintaining their posts across the globe. Alex waited until Victor's routine monitoring session ended and the old operator retired to his sleeping quarters. The bunker fell silent except for the constant electrical hum of standby equipment. Moving carefully through the corridors, Alex began examining areas he hadn't explored during his initial discovery. In the main control room, he found fresh evidence of Victor's presence. A coffee cup still held warmth, and crumbs from a simple meal scattered across a metal tray suggested the operator had eaten recently. More telling were the footprints in the thin layer of dust that had accumulated in less frequently used areas of the bunker. The prince told a story of daily routines maintained over decades. Paths worn into the concrete floor showed Victor's regular movements between the sleeping quarters, control room, and maintenance areas. But newer prints, sharper and deeper, indicated someone who moved with purpose and carried the weight of responsibility. Alex followed a set of prints that led to a section of the bunker he hadn't yet explored. Behind a heavy steel door, marked with radiation warnings in Russian, he discovered a storage area filled with supplies that had obviously been replenished regularly. Cases of military rations, medical supplies, and replacement parts for the radio equipment were stacked with military precision. What caught Alex's attention was the variety of dates on the supply containers. While some bore Soviet-era markings from the 1980s, others were clearly modern, with shipping labels in contemporary Russian and dates within the past few months. Someone had been keeping this station supplied for decades, even after the fall of the Soviet Union. In a corner of the storage room, Alex found a weapons cache that made his blood run cold. Modern assault rifles, ammunition, and military-grade equipment were secured in a locked cabinet that had been left partially open. The weapons were clean, well-maintained, and clearly functional. This wasn't just a communication station, it was a military installation, prepared for defensive operations. Among the weapons, Alex discovered an identification badge that had apparently fallen from Victor's belongings. The laminated card bore the photograph he had seen earlier, along with official Soviet seals and text identifying Viktor Kozlov as a senior lieutenant in the Committee for State Security, the KGB. The badge was dated 1982, but its pristine condition suggested it had been carefully preserved. The implications were staggering. Victor wasn't just maintaining old equipment out of nostalgia or duty to a defunct government. He was an active KGB operative who had continued his mission for 40 years after the Soviet Union's collapse. The question was, who was giving him orders and what was his actual mission? Alex continued exploring and found Victor's personal quarters beyond the simple sleeping area. A small office contained filing cabinets filled with personnel records, mission briefings, and operational orders that spanned decades. The documents were meticulously organized, with recent materials filed alongside historical records as if the Cold War had never ended. The personnel files contained disturbing information about other network operators, photographs, biographical data, and operational assessments for dozens of individuals who had maintained similar installations across the globe. Red stamps marked many files as terminated or compromised, with dates indicating when each operator had gone silent. World map mounted on the wall showed the original scope of the network, with red pins marking active stations and black pins indicating installations that had been discovered or destroyed. The pattern was clear. Someone was systematically eliminating the remaining operators. Of the original network that had once spanned continents, only a handful of stations remained operational. Victor's mission files revealed the true purpose of Nightingale 7. The station wasn't just maintaining communications, it was coordinating a network of sleeper agents and deep cover operatives who had remained in place long after their official mission had ended. These agents, scattered across Western nations, represented the Soviet Union's ultimate insurance policy. The most recent mission briefings contained orders that chilled Alex to the bone. Victor had been instructed to prepare for final protocol, a last resort activation of all remaining sleeper assets. The transmission scheduled for tomorrow would either activate these dormant agents or send the codes necessary to shut down the network. Permanently, Alex found evidence that Victor had been monitoring international intelligence activities, tracking efforts by various governments to locate and eliminate the remaining Soviet sleeper networks. Recent reports indicated that professional teams, not government agents but private contractors, were hunting the remaining operators for purposes unknown. In Victor's personal effects, Alex discovered something that humanized the old spy. a photograph of a young woman and child with a letter that had never been sent. The letter, written in Russian, appeared to be addressed to Victor's daughter, explaining his absence and expressing love for a family he had sacrificed for duty to a state that no longer existed. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted Alex's investigation. Victor was returning to the control room, and Alex realized he had spent too much time exploring. He quickly gathered the KGB identification badge and retreated to his hiding place, but not before noticing fresh tire tracks outside the bunker entrance, tracks that hadn't been there when he arrived. Alex waited until dawn before slipping out of the bunker, his mind reeling from everything he had discovered. The fresh tire tracks outside the entrance were clearly visible in the soft earth. A vehicle had been here recently, and it wasn't Victor's. The old operator had arrived on foot, as evidenced by his walking path through the forest. Following a reference in the station logs to a nearby village, Alex hiked through dense pine forest toward coordinates that should have led to a settlement called Koznica. The village had been mentioned repeatedly in the early operational logs, apparently serving as a cover story for the radio station's personnel during the Cold War era. What Alex found defied explanation. Buildings stood exactly as they had been left decades ago, as if time had stopped in 1962, houses with doors ajar, shops with merchandise still on shelves, and a small school where children's drawings remained pinned to classroom walls. Nature had begun reclaiming the structures, but slowly, as if reluctant to disturb whatever tragedy had occurred here. In the village center, Alex discovered an official document nailed to a wooden post. The faded paper, written in Ukrainian and Russian, bore the seal of the Soviet Ministry of Emergency Situations. It was an evacuation order dated October 1962, during the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, instructing all residents to leave immediately for temporary relocation due to military exercises. The evacuation had clearly been permanent. Belongings remained where families had left them, suggesting people had expected to return within days or weeks. Photographs sat on mantelpieces. Clothing hung in wardrobes and meals remained on tables. Now decades-old dust covering everything like a grey shroud. Alex was examining the evacuation order when he heard movement in one of the houses. An elderly woman emerged from a cottage that, unlike the others, showed signs of recent habitation. She was perhaps 80 years old, with silver hair braided down her back and clothes that belonged to another era. "You are not the first to come looking," she said in accented English, studying Alex with sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. "But you are the first who seems surprised by what you find." Elena Vasquez had the weathered appearance of someone who had lived through hardships that would break younger people. Her cottage was simply furnished but clean, with a vegetable garden that suggested she had been caring for herself in this abandoned place for decades. "I am Elena," she said, gesturing for Alex to sit on her porch. "I was 23 when they told us to leave. Everyone else went. I stayed." She explained that her brother Dmitri had worked at the facility in the forest. She never called it by name, but her meaning was clear. When the evacuation order came, families were told the absence would be temporary. Emergency transportation would take them to safety while military exercises concluded. "They said 3 days, maybe a week," Elena continued. "Dmitri told me to go with the others, that his work was too important to abandon. I told him I would wait for him here." Elena had been waiting for 60 years. She showed Alex a family photograph taken just before the evacuation. Her brother Dmitri stood in the center, wearing a Soviet military uniform with communication insignia. He was young and serious, with the bearing of someone entrusted with critical responsibilities. Beside him stood Elena and their parents, all dressed in their finest clothes for what would be their last family portrait. Every few years, "I see lights in the forest," Elena said, pointing toward the radio station's location. "Sometimes I hear the machines working at night. I know someone still tends to whatever Dmitri was protecting." She described decades of strange incidents, vehicles that passed through the village at night, supplies that appeared at the forest edge, and the occasional glimpse of a figure maintaining the equipment that her brother had operated. The ghost who kept the radios alive, she called him. But recently, there have been others, Elena's voice carried warning. Men who come with questions about the facility, about anyone who might know its secrets. They do not ask politely. She led Alex to her kitchen and showed him damage to her door and windows, evidence of forced entry attempts. Someone had searched her cottage, looking for information about the radio station or its operator. Elena had hidden in the forest during these intrusions, watching professional teams systematically examine every building in the abandoned village. They are not government men, she said with certainty. Government men follow rules, show papers. These men follow no rules. Elena warned Alex that his presence in the forest had not gone unnoticed. She had observed surveillance equipment being installed around the village perimeter over the past week. Someone was monitoring the area, waiting for something or someone to emerge. The ghost in the forest, he is old now like me, Elena said sadly. But his work is not finished. There are those who would steal what he protects, use it for purposes my brother would never have approved. As Alex prepared to leave, Elena pressed the family photograph into his hands. "Show this to the ghost," she said. "Tell him Dimitri's sister still remembers. Tell him some promises should never be broken, but some secrets are too dangerous to keep." Elena led Alex back into her cottage, where afternoon sunlight filtered through lace curtains that had hung unchanged for decades. The interior reflected a life suspended in time, with furniture and decorations that spoke of a family torn apart by circumstances beyond their control. "Dimitri was 7 years older than me," Elena began, settling into a worn armchair beside a small table covered with photographs. Always serious, always studying. Even as a boy, he was fascinated by radios and electronics. Our father said he had magic in his fingers when it came to making machines work. She picked up the family photograph and traced her brother's face with weathered fingers. He joined the army in 1959, but not as regular soldier. Special training, they called it. Communication systems, cryptography, things I did not understand. When he came home on leave, he spoke little about his work. Elena explained that Dimitri had been assigned to the forest facility in early 1962, shortly after its construction. The cover story told to locals was that the installation was a weather monitoring station, but Elena had known better. The equipment trucks that arrived at night, the security perimeter that was established, and the way her brother's demeanor changed told a different story. He became distant, burdened, Elena recalled. The responsibility was enormous, he said. He carried secrets that could change the world, and the weight of that knowledge aged him beyond his years. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Dimitri had worked around the clock at the facility. Elena remembered those terrible October days when the world balanced on the edge of nuclear war. Her brother would return home exhausted, his hands shaking from fatigue and stress, but never speaking about what happened during those crucial weeks. The night before the evacuation order came, Dimitri visited me. Elena continued. He was different, frightened in a way I had never seen. He said terrible things might happen, that his work might have consequences he never intended. Elena walked to an old wooden chest and withdrew items she had kept for 60 years. Dimitri's personal effects included technical manuals, family letters, and a small notebook filled with his handwriting. The notebook contained what appeared to be personal observations about his work, written in a code that only he understood. "He gave me this the night before everyone left," Elena said, showing Alex a small key. "Said if anything happened to him, I should use it to open something important. But he never told me what. The key was unusual, not a standard door or cabinet key, but something designed for specialized equipment. Its brass surface was marked with Cyrillic characters and a serial number that suggested it belonged to specific Soviet-era machinery." Elena shared memories of her brother's final visit. He'd spoken about moral conflicts, about following orders that troubled his conscience. The facility's mission had expanded beyond its original purpose, and Dmitri had become increasingly uncomfortable with the directives he received from Moscow. He said the work would continue long after the crisis passed, Elena recalled, that men like him would be expected to maintain their posts regardless of what happened to the governments that gave them orders. He feared he would never be allowed to come home. Elena's cottage contained subtle evidence of her decades-long vigil. Maps of the surrounding forest with paths marked to observation points where she could watch the facility without being seen. Notebooks documenting the lights and activity she had observed over the years. A collection of items that had appeared near the village, supply drops or lost equipment from whoever maintained the installation. For 20 years after the evacuation, I hoped Dmitri would return, Elena said. Then I began to understand that whoever operates the facility now carries the same burden my brother did. The same isolation, the same impossible choices. She showed Alex a letter she had written but never delivered, addressed to whoever had taken over her brother's duties. In it, she offered understanding for the sacrifices required by duty, forgiveness for choices made in service to causes larger than personal happiness, and the promise that someone remembered the human cost of such dedication. "The ghost in the forest is not my brother," Eleanor said with quiet certainty. "But he carries my brother's legacy. In some ways that makes him family." Elena warned Alex about the increasing surveillance around the village. In recent weeks, she had observed professional teams using sophisticated equipment to monitor the area. Unlike previous government inspections that had occurred over the decades, these new visitors showed no official credentials and followed no bureaucratic procedures. "They seek something specific," Elena said. "Not just information about the facility, but something my brother or his successor possesses. Something valuable enough to employ mercenaries rather than official agents." As evening approached, Elena insisted that Alex stay for dinner. Her simple meal of preserved vegetables and bread carried the weight of hospitality offered by someone who had been alone too long. During their quiet conversation, she revealed that she had seen Alex's arrival at the facility through binoculars, and had been waiting to see if he would seek out the village that the maps referenced. "You have kind eyes," Elena observed. "Not like the others who have come asking questions. Perhaps you can help the ghost in the forest understand that some secrets are too dangerous to keep, but some promises should never be broken." Alex returned to the radio station as darkness fell, carrying portable recording equipment he had retrieved from his hiking gear. Elena's warnings about surveillance made him approach the facility with extreme caution, using forest paths that would minimize his visibility to any watchers who might be monitoring the area. The bunker appeared quiet, with only the faint glow of emergency lighting visible through ventilation grates. Alex positioned himself in the trees where he could observe the entrance while remaining hidden. According to the transmission schedule he had seen, Victor should begin his operational routine within the next hour. At precisely 2147 hours, exterior lighting illuminated the bunker entrance. Victor emerged from the forest along a path Alex hadn't noticed before, moving with the careful steps of someone who had walked the same route thousands of times in darkness. The old operator carried a canvas bag and moved with purpose that suggested tonight's transmission was particularly important. Alex activated his recording equipment as Victor disappeared into the bunker. Within minutes, the electrical hum that surrounded the facility intensified, indicating the main transmitter was being brought online. Through ventilation openings, Alex could hear the distinctive sounds of vintage electronics warming up, vacuum tubes reaching operating temperature, and transformers adjusting to increased power loads. Victor's operational routine was precisely timed. Equipment checks, frequency calibration, and antenna positioning occurred in the same sequence Alex had observed earlier. But tonight carried additional urgency. Victor consulted multiple reference materials and spent considerable time verifying encryption protocols that would ensure his transmission remained undetectable. At exactly 2200 hours, Victor began his transmission. The audio recording device captured the distinctive sound of high-frequency radio signals being generated at power levels that would propagate across continents. But what Alex heard through his equipment was unlike any radio communication he had ever encountered. The transmission consisted of numerical sequences delivered in a monotone voice speaking Russian. Groups of 5 numbers, transmitted slowly and repeated 3 times before moving to the next sequence. This was a numbers station, one of the mysterious radio broadcasts that intelligence agencies had used throughout the Cold War to communicate with agents in foreign countries. Victor's transmission continued for exactly 17 minutes, covering multiple frequency changes and repeating each numerical sequence with mechanical precision. The numbers themselves appeared random, but Alex understood they represented encrypted instructions that would be meaningless without the proper decryption keys. Between transmission segments, Victor monitored response frequencies, listening for acknowledgements from other stations in the network. The responses, when they came, were brief and cryptic, single letters or short numerical sequences that confirmed receipt of his message. Alex watched Victor through binoculars as the old operator worked. Despite his advanced age, Victor moved with the efficiency of someone whose skills had been honed through decades of practice. His hands operated the equipment without hesitation, adjusting controls and monitoring signal strength with the expertise of a master craftsman. What disturbed Alex was Victor's physical appearance. Even at distance, the old man seemed frail, his movements occasionally unsteady in ways that suggested declining health. The burden of maintaining this station alone was clearly taking its toll. Yet Victor continued his mission with unwavering dedication. During frequency changes, Alex heard Victor speaking into a microphone using conversational Russian. These transmissions were different from the numerical codes. They appeared to be personal communications with other operators in the network. Victor's voice carried weariness and concern as he discussed situations that required immediate attention. The recording equipment captured references to terminated nodes and compromised assets, suggesting the network was under active attack. Victor mentioned locations in Poland, East Germany, and the Czech Republic, where stations had gone silent under suspicious circumstances. Someone was systematically eliminating the remaining operators. Victor's most chilling transmission was a personal message to someone identified only as Blackbird. In careful Russian, he described surveillance around his location and expressed concern that his own position might be compromised. He requested immediate extraction protocols and authorization to implement final protocol if his situation became untenable. The response from Blackbird was immediate and decisive. Victor was ordered to maintain his position and prepare for the final network transmission scheduled for the following evening. All remaining stations would participate in a coordinated broadcast that would either activate dormant assets or permanently shut down the entire operation. As Victor concluded his transmission, Alex noticed movement in the forest beyond the facility. Thermal imaging equipment briefly reflected starlight, suggesting professional surveillance teams were indeed monitoring the station. Victor was being watched by parties unknown, and his next transmission would likely trigger a confrontation. Victor completed his shutdown procedures and secured the equipment before disappearing into the bunker's sleeping quarters. The facility returned to its passive monitoring mode, but Alex could sense the tension that surrounded the installation. Tomorrow evening's transmission would determine the fate of a network that had operated in secret for over 60 years. Alex remained hidden until he was certain Victor had settled for the night. The recorded transmission would require careful analysis, but already he understood that he had witnessed something historically Significant, the final operations of a Soviet intelligence network that had survived the end of the Cold War. Alex spent the morning in Elena's cottage, using her kitchen table to analyze the recordings he had captured during Victor's transmission. The numerical sequences filled pages of his notebook, but without proper decryption keys. They remained meaningless strings of digits that could represent anything from operational orders to target coordinates. Elena watched with interest as Alex worked, occasionally offering tea or simple meals while he struggled with the cryptographic puzzle. Her cottage provided the perfect cover for his activities, remote enough to avoid detection, yet close enough to the radio station for him to monitor ongoing developments. "My brother once showed me something," Elena said quietly, retrieving an old leather-bound Bible from her bookshelf. "He said that during the war, resistance fighters would hide important information in religious texts because occupying forces rarely examined them carefully." Elena opened the Bible to the Book of Psalms, where several pages had been carefully hollowed out to create a hidden compartment. Inside, Alex discovered a small notebook and a collection of thin metal strips covered with numerical sequences. The notebook was filled with Dimitri's handwriting, documenting what appeared to be cipher keys and decryption protocols. "Dimitri left this with me before the evacuation," Elena explained. "Said it was insurance in case something happened to the official codes. He never explained exactly how to use it, but he said the numbers would make sense to someone who understood the system." Alex studied the metal strips, recognizing them as one-time cipher keys used by intelligence agencies during the Cold War. Each strip contained unique numerical sequences that would be used once and then destroyed, making encrypted communications theoretically unbreakable without the corresponding key. Using Dimitri's notebook as a guide, Alex began the painstaking process of applying the cipher keys to Victor's transmission. The mathematical relationships were complex, requiring careful attention to timing, frequency changes, and transmission protocols that had been established decades earlier. The first breakthrough came when Alex successfully decrypted a segment that referenced Package 7, an operational designation that appeared repeatedly throughout Victor's communications. The decoded message contained coordinates for locations across Eastern Europe, along with activation codes that would apparently awaken sleeper agents who had remained dormant since the Cold War. Additional decryption revealed the true scope of the network's final mission. The remaining operators were coordinating the activation of deep cover assets placed in strategic positions throughout Western governments, military organizations, and industrial facilities. These agents had lived normal lives for decades, waiting for activation codes that would trigger their ultimate mission. But the most disturbing discovery was evidence that someone else possessed these same activation codes. Intercepted communications suggested that private contractors had acquired network protocols and were attempting to activate sleeper assets for their own purposes. The systematic elimination of network operators was designed to prevent official shutdown of the program Victor's transmission, had included specific warnings about unauthorized activation attempts in Poland and Germany, where dormant agents had been contacted by unknown parties claiming to represent continued Soviet authority. These rogue activations had triggered security responses that exposed and eliminated several long-term assets. Alex found references to Final Protocol, the network's ultimate contingency plan. If the remaining operators determined that the network had been compromised beyond recovery, they would transmit shutdown codes that would permanently deactivate all remaining assets. This would prevent the sleeper program from being exploited by hostile forces, but would also waste decades of intelligence investment. The decrypted messages revealed Victor's internal conflict. As the senior surviving operator, he had authority to implement Final Protocol, but doing so would abandon agents who had sacrificed their entire lives for the mission. Many sleeper assets had families and established lives that would be destroyed by exposure. Even if they were never activated, Elena's brother's notebook contained personal observations about the moral complexities of the sleeper program. Dmitri had documented his growing unease with missions that required agents to live false lives for indefinite periods, severing all connections to their true identities and homeland. The psychological cost of such deep cover operations troubled him deeply. Alex discovered that Victor had been attempting to contact surviving sleeper assets directly, warning them of the security breach and offering extraction to safe locations. But many agents had been in place so long that they no longer responded to old contact protocols. Having genuinely assimilated into their cover identities, the most chilling revelation was a decoded message describing surveillance around multiple network locations. Professional teams were monitoring remaining stations, waiting for the final transmission that would provide complete access to the sleeper network. Victor's transmission tomorrow would either save the remaining assets or deliver them directly to hostile forces. As Alex worked through the final encrypted segments, he realized that Victor's situation was more desperate than he had initially understood. The old operator was not just the last guardian of obsolete Soviet intelligence assets. He was the only person standing between a compromised network and those who would exploit it for unknown purposes. Elena watched Alex's expression grow increasingly, grim as he decoded message after message. "You understand now why my brother could never come home," she said softly. "Some responsibilities cannot be abandoned, even when the cause they serve no longer exists." Alex returned to the radio station that afternoon, driven by the urgent need to understand Victor's technical preparations for the final transmission. The decoded messages had revealed that atmospheric conditions would be crucial for reaching all remaining network nodes simultaneously, and Victor had been monitoring weather patterns with the intensity of someone whose mission depended on perfect timing. Inside the bunker, Alex discovered sophisticated meteorological equipment that he had initially overlooked. Banks of atmospheric monitoring devices tracked ionospheric conditions across the northern hemisphere, providing real-time data on radio wave propagation that would determine optimal transmission windows. The weather station equipment was a fascinating blend of vintage Soviet technology and modern satellite communication systems. Barometric pressure sensors, atmospheric electrical field monitors, and solar radiation detectors fed data into computers that calculated signal propagation models with remarkable precision. Victor had maintained and upgraded these systems over decades, ensuring their continued accuracy. Alex studied the atmospheric data displays, recognizing patterns that indicated an approaching geomagnetic storm. Solar activity was increasing, creating ionospheric disturbances that would dramatically affect radio wave propagation. Under normal circumstances, such conditions would disrupt communications, but Victor's equipment suggested he planned to exploit these disturbances rather than avoid them. The propagation models showed that tomorrow evening's predicted storm would create a unique atmospheric window lasting approximately 30 minutes. During this period, signals transmitted on specific frequencies would bounce off the ionosphere with extraordinary efficiency, allowing communications to reach distances normally impossible with the station's power levels. Victor's transmission logs documented years of atmospheric observations, noting optimal conditions for long-range communications. The old operator had developed an encyclopedic understanding of how solar activity, seasonal variations, and geographic factors affected signal propagation. His preparations for tomorrow's transmission represented the culmination of decades of expertise. Alex found detailed calculations showing transmission timing down to the minute. The atmospheric window would open at 2156 hours local time and remain optimal until 2227 hours. During this brief period, Victor could simultaneously reach network nodes in North America, Asia, and Europe using power levels that would normally provide only regional coverage. The technical complexity was staggering. Victor had calculated frequency selections, power levels, and antenna configurations that would optimize signal strength for each geographic region. Different parts of his transmission would use different frequencies, switching automatically as atmospheric conditions changed during the propagation window. What impressed Alex most was Victor's integration of modern weather satellite data with vintage Soviet equipment. Satellite feeds provided current atmospheric imagery, while ground-based sensors measured local conditions that affected signal transmission. The combination allowed Victor to predict optimal transmission conditions with remarkable accuracy. The atmospheric monitoring revealed another crucial factor. The approaching storm would also interfere with electronic surveillance equipment. Ground-based radio direction finding systems would be significantly degraded during the geomagnetic disturbance. Providing Victor with natural camouflage for his transmission, Alex studied Victor's contingency plans for different atmospheric scenarios. If conditions were suboptimal, the transmission could be delayed up to 72 hours while waiting for the next suitable propagation window. But the urgency of recent communications suggested that delay might not be possible. External pressures were forcing Victor to proceed regardless of conditions. The weather data also revealed why Victor's location had been chosen for this installation. The surrounding mountains created unique atmospheric effects that enhanced signal propagation in specific directions. Soviet engineers had selected this site not just for its isolation, but for its natural advantages in long-range communication. Victor's equipment included emergency backup systems designed to continue operating even if primary power failed during the transmission. Battery systems, diesel generators, and manual controls would allow the station to complete its mission under adverse conditions. The level of redundancy suggested operations too critical to risk technical failure. Alex discovered that Victor had been tracking the movements of the surveillance teams through their electronic signatures. Radio frequency emissions from their equipment appeared on his monitors as interference patterns that revealed their locations and activities. The old operator was well aware that he was being watched, but he had turned his technical expertise into a defensive advantage. The most sobering discovery was Victor's analysis of signal interception capabilities. Modern surveillance systems could capture and analyze radio transmissions in real time, potentially compromising the network even as Victor attempted to contact remaining nodes. Tomorrow's transmission would be a race between Victor's message and the sophisticated equipment trying to intercept it. Victor's preparations included elaborate electronic countermeasures designed to confuse interception attempts. Decoy transmissions, frequency hopping, and signal masking techniques would make it difficult for hostile forces to distinguish between actual network communications and false signals intended to mislead surveillance equipment. As Alex absorbed the technical complexity of Victor's mission, he realized that tomorrow's transmission represented far more than simple communication with distant agents. It was a carefully orchestrated technical operation that would determine whether decades of intelligence work would be preserved or fall into hostile hands. Alex was studying atmospheric data when footsteps echoed through the bunker's main corridor. He turned to find Victor standing in the doorway, no longer the distant figure Alex had observed from hiding. The old operator held a Makarov pistol with steady hands, but his expression showed more curiosity than hostility. "You read Russian?" Victor observed in accented English, noting the decrypted messages scattered across Alex's workspace. "And you understand atmospheric propagation models? Most hikers do not possess such specialized knowledge." Alex raised his hands slowly, meeting Victor's penetrating gaze. The old man's eyes held the wariness of someone who had survived decades in a profession where trust was a potentially fatal luxury. Yet there was also exhaustion in his bearing, the weight of solitary responsibility carried too long. "I'm not here to interfere with your mission," Alex said carefully. "I stumbled onto this place by accident, but I've learned enough to understand what you're protecting." Victor studied Alex for a long moment before lowering the pistol. "Accident," he repeated with a bitter smile. "In my experience, there are very few true accidents. Someone sent you, or you were following intelligence that led you here." "Elena Vasquez sent me," Alex replied. "She said you might need to know that Dimitri's sister still remembers." The effect of those words on Victor was immediate and profound. The old operator's careful composure cracked, revealing decades of suppressed emotion. He sank into a chair, suddenly looking every one of his 70-plus years. "You met Elena," Victor whispered. "She is still alive, still waiting." Alex showed Victor the family photograph Elena had given him. Victor's weathered hands trembled as he studied the image of Dimitri in his Soviet uniform, surrounded by family who had believed they would see him again within days. "Dimitri was my predecessor," Victor explained. "He trained me before his death in 1963, pneumonia, contracted during the crisis. He died believing he had failed his mission, abandoned his family for a cause that might not survive the changes coming to our country." Victor retrieved his personal journal from a locked drawer, a leather-bound volume filled with decades of handwritten entries documenting his thoughts, fears, and observations. The journal revealed a man wrestling with profound moral conflicts while maintaining unwavering dedication to his duty. "For 40 years, I have continued Dimitri's work," Victor continued. "Through the collapse of the Soviet Union, the chaos of the transition years, the emergence of new threats that our original mission never anticipated, I remained because someone had to maintain the network." Victor's journal contained entries spanning from his assignment to Nightingale 7 in 1963 through the present day. Early entries showed a young officer proud to serve his country. Later entries revealed growing doubts about the wisdom of maintaining sleeper networks that might never be activated. The most recent entries documented Victor's increasing isolation as other network operators were eliminated or simply disappeared. He had watched the systematic destruction of installations across Eastern Europe, wondering when his own location would be discovered and whether he would choose to fight or surrender. The network was designed to survive the unthinkable, Victor explained. Nuclear war, governmental collapse, the complete restructuring of the world order. But we never anticipated that it would be compromised by those seeking profit rather than ideology, Victor showed Alex. Intelligence reports documenting the activities of private military contractors who had been hunting surviving network operators. These mercenaries were not working for any government, but for wealthy clients who wanted to acquire sleeper assets for corporate espionage or criminal enterprises. "They have been systematic," Victor said, indicating a map where eliminated stations were marked with red X's. Poland, East Germany, Romania, Hungary. Each station compromised, each operator either killed or forced to reveal network protocols before their deaths. Alex learned that Victor's survival had depended on his technical expertise and the isolated location of his facility, while other operators had been discovered through electronic surveillance or human intelligence. Victor had managed to remain hidden by adapting his procedures and maintaining strict operational security. Tomorrow's transmission will either save the remaining assets or deliver them to our enemies, Victor said with quiet resignation. "I have the authority to implement final protocol, but doing so will abandon agents who have sacrificed everything for the mission." Victor opened his journal to recent entries describing his internal struggle. Should he activate remaining sleeper assets, knowing they would likely be captured or killed? Should he implement final protocol, essentially murdering loyal agents who had maintained their cover for decades? Or should he simply disappear, leaving the network to whatever fate awaited it? "I am the last," Victor said simply. "When I am gone, 60 years of sacrifice and dedication dies with me. But perhaps that is the kindest ending for those who have served so faithfully." Alex realized that Victor's solitary vigil had been sustained not just by duty, but by the hope that his sacrifice served some greater purpose. The revelation that the network was being hunted by mercenaries rather than enemy governments had shattered that hope. Victor led Alex to a secure room he hadn't previously accessed, unlocking the door with Eleanor's brother's key that Alex still carried. Inside, a massive wall map dominated the space, showing the original scope of the Soviet sleeper network with unprecedented detail. Operation Nightingale was established in 1961, Victor began, his voice carrying the weight of forbidden knowledge. 37 installations across 6 continents, each maintaining contact with deep cover assets placed in strategic positions throughout the Western world. The map displayed not just communication stations, but the locations of sleeper agents who had been inserted into target countries over decades. Red pins marked confirmed active assets, yellow pins indicated agents whose status was uncertain, and black pins showed those who had been compromised or eliminated. Victor explained that the sleeper program had evolved far beyond simple espionage. Agents had been placed in government ministries, defense contractors, research institutions, and financial organizations. Many had risen to positions of significant influence, their true loyalties hidden beneath decades of carefully constructed false identities. The original plan assumed activation during World War III, Victor continued. These agents would have sabotaged critical infrastructure, stolen military secrets, and disrupted enemy command structures during global conflict. But the war never came, and the agents remained in place. The network map revealed the true scope of the operation. Sleeper cells existed in the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, France, West Germany, and other NATO countries. Each cell operated independently, known only to their communication station and a handful of control officers who had since died or disappeared. Victor showed Alex detailed files on individual agents, biographical data, cover identities, and mission assignments that painted a picture of extraordinary dedication and sacrifice. Many agents had married, raised families, and built genuine lives around their false identities, making activation increasingly complex from both operational and humanitarian perspectives. Agent Redbird has been a software engineer in Silicon Valley for 35 years, Victor said, indicating one file. He has children who believe he emigrated from Poland seeking better opportunities. His activation would destroy not just his life, but theirs as well. The files revealed the psychological profiles of agents who had maintained their cover so completely that many had likely forgotten their original identities. Regular psychological evaluations, conducted through seemingly routine communications, showed increasing integration into their host societies and growing reluctance to acknowledge their true purpose. Victor's records documented several unauthorized activation attempts over the past 2 years. Private contractors had apparently acquired partial network information and were attempting to contact sleeper agents directly, offering financial incentives for cooperation or threatening exposure to force compliance. Agent Blackbird responded to an unauthorized contact in Berlin, Victor explained, showing Alex intercepted communications. The contractors offered 50 million euros for technical specifications from his position at a defense research facility. When he refused, they exposed him to German intelligence. The systematic elimination of network operators had been designed to prevent official shutdown procedures that would warn remaining agents of the security breach. By eliminating Victor and his remaining colleagues, the contractors hoped to maintain access to sleeper assets without triggering protective protocols. Victor revealed that several agents had already been compromised through these unauthorized approaches. Their subsequent interrogation by hostile intelligence services had provided additional information about network structure and communication protocols, creating a cascade of security breaches. The irony is profound, Victor observed. These agents survived the entire Cold War, maintained their cover through the Soviet collapse, and endured decades of isolation. Now they face exposure not by enemy governments, but by criminals seeking to exploit their access for profit. The network map showed the devastating scope of recent losses. Of the original 37 stations, only 5 remained operational. Of the hundreds of sleeper agents originally deployed, fewer than 30 maintained secure communication. With their control stations, Victor's most closely guarded secret was the existence of a master shutdown protocol that could simultaneously contact all remaining agents with extraction orders. Implementation would require coordination between surviving stations, but would allow loyal assets to disappear before hostile forces could locate them. The shutdown protocol was designed as a final mercy, Victor explained. If the network faced inevitable compromise, we could at least save the lives of those who had served so faithfully. But implementing the protocol required unanimous agreement from surviving station commanders. Victor had lost contact with his colleagues in Romania and the Czech Republic over the past month, leaving him uncertain whether they had been compromised or simply gone silent for operational security. Tomorrow's transmission will determine everything, Victor said. If I receive proper authentication from the other stations, we implement coordinated shutdown. If not, I must assume the network has been compromised and act unilaterally. Alex studied the network map, understanding finally the true weight of Victor's responsibility. The old operator held the lives of dozens of people in his hands, along with secrets that could reshape understanding of Cold War intelligence operations. "What will you do if the other stations don't respond?" Alex asked. Victor's answer was quiet but resolute. "I will choose mercy over mission success. These people have given enough." Alex examined his satellite phone for the first time since discovering the radio station, intending to check messages from his hiking companions who expected regular position updates. What he found instead chilled him to the bone. Sophisticated tracking software had been remotely installed on his device, monitoring his precise location for the past 4 days. "They've been watching me since before I found this place," Alex realized, showing Victor the phone's modified operating system. The tracking software was military-grade, designed to remain undetectable while transmitting location data to remote monitoring stations. Victor studied the device with the analytical mind of someone trained in electronic surveillance. "This is not standard commercial tracking," he concluded. "The software architecture suggests state-level capabilities, but the implementation indicates private contractors with access to classified technologies." The implications were staggering. Alex's discovery of the radio station hadn't been accidental. Someone had been guiding him toward this location, using his movements to confirm the facility's existence and map its defensive capabilities. His hiking route, carefully planned to avoid populated areas, had actually led him directly to one of the world's most sensitive intelligence installations. Victor activated his own counter-surveillance equipment, revealing the electronic signature of monitoring devices that had been positioned around the facility during the past week. Professional surveillance teams had established a perimeter using motion sensors, thermal imaging cameras, and radio frequency analyzers that could detect any attempt to leave the installation. "They are not here to capture the facility," Victor analyzed, studying the surveillance pattern. "They want to intercept tomorrow's transmission and use it to access the entire network. Your arrival provided the confirmation they needed that this station is still operational." Alex felt the weight of unwitting complicity in the network's potential destruction. His presence had essentially marked the target for forces that intended to exploit decades of intelligence work for unknown purposes. The responsibility was crushing, but it also clarified what needed to be done. Victor's counter-surveillance revealed at least 12 monitoring positions surrounding the station, indicating a substantial professional team with significant resources. Thermal imaging suggested personnel with military training and equipment, not corporate security or government agents following standard procedures. Your phone has been transmitting our conversations, Victor realized, examining the device's audio processing capabilities. They know about Elena, about the network structure, about tomorrow's transmission schedule. We have perhaps hours before they move against us. The satellite phone's tracking history revealed the full scope of the surveillance operation. Alex's movements had been monitored from the moment he entered the region, with his route subtly influenced through carefully placed trail markers and blocked paths that guided him toward the radio station. Victor showed Alex how to identify the electronic signatures of professional surveillance equipment. Radio frequency sweeps revealed hidden cameras, motion sensors, and communication devices that formed an invisible net around the facility. The Watchers were using sophisticated equipment that suggested substantial financial backing. Military contractors, Victor concluded. Former special operations personnel with access to classified surveillance technologies. They have been hired by someone with both significant resources and detailed knowledge of the network's operational procedures. The monitoring equipment included signal analysis systems, capable of intercepting and decoding radio transmissions in real time. Tomorrow's broadcast would be captured and analyzed within minutes of transmission, potentially providing access to encryption, keys, and network protocols that had remained secret for decades. Victor revealed that he had detected similar surveillance signatures around the abandoned village where Elena lived. The old woman was being monitored, her cottage searched repeatedly for information about the radio station and its operations. Elena's safety depended on the fiction that she knew nothing about current activities. They have been patient, Victor observed, establishing surveillance, gathering intelligence, waiting for the optimal moment to strike. Your arrival was the final piece they needed, confirmation that the station remains active, and that tomorrow's transmission will proceed as scheduled. Alex discovered that his satellite phone contained sophisticated malware designed to activate recording functions remotely. Every conversation with Victor had been captured and transmitted to unknown recipients who now possessed detailed knowledge of the network's structure and planned shutdown procedures. The realization that hostile forces possessed complete intelligence about tomorrow's mission fundamentally changed Victor's operational calculations. The careful plans he had developed over months of preparation were now compromised, forcing him to improvise strategies for a situation he had never anticipated. "We have one advantage," Victor said grimly. "They believe they understand our intentions, but they do not know about the contingency protocols I have never documented. Some secrets were never written down, never transmitted, known only to operators who learned them through direct training." Victor began activating defensive systems that Alex hadn't known existed. Hidden weapon emplacements, electronic countermeasures, and communication systems that operated independently of the main radio equipment. The station had been designed to survive hostile action, and Victor intended to use every defensive capability at his disposal. "Tomorrow's transmission will proceed," Victor declared, "but not in the way our Watchers expect." Victor led Alex to the most secure section of the bunker, accessed through a hidden panel that required two separate keys operated simultaneously. Inside, Alex discovered the true heart of Operation Nightingale, a vault containing activation codes that could awaken every remaining sleeper agent simultaneously or shut them down permanently. "These are the crown jewels of Soviet intelligence," Victor explained, revealing a series of sealed packets arranged in chronological order. Each packet contained one-time activation codes, synchronized with agents deployed during specific time periods, allowing precise control over network operations. The activation codes represented the culmination of decades of intelligence work. Mathematical sequences that had been distributed to sleeper agents during their initial deployment, memorized and never written down, waiting for the specific combination that would trigger their ultimate mission. Possessing these codes meant controlling assets worth billions in intelligence value. Victor showed Alex the two-key system required to access the codes. One key had been in his possession since 1963, while the second key was supposed to remain with his immediate superior, an officer who had died during the Soviet collapse. Victor had recovered the second key from his superior's body, making him the sole guardian of the network's most sensitive secrets. The original plan required authorization from Moscow before activation, Victor explained. But Moscow no longer exists in any form that would understand these operations. I've become both operator and authority, guardian and judge of whether these assets live or die. The activation protocols were surprisingly complex, requiring not just the mathematical codes, but specific atmospheric conditions, transmission timing, and authentication procedures that would prevent unauthorized use. Even someone who stole the codes would need Victor's technical expertise and specialized equipment to implement them successfully. Victor revealed that the codes had two distinct functions. Standard activation would awaken agents for specific missions while maintaining their cover identities. Final activation would trigger immediate extraction procedures, bringing agents home, but destroying decades of careful positioning within target organizations. There is a third option, Victor said quietly, showing Alex a separate sealed packet marked with Cyrillic text, termination codes that would instruct agents to eliminate themselves rather than face capture. This was designed as the ultimate security measure, ensuring that network secrets would die with the agents rather than be revealed under interrogation. The moral weight of such power was staggering. Victor held the authority to activate agents who had waited decades for their call to action, or to order the deaths of loyal operatives who had sacrificed everything for their mission. The burden of such decisions had clearly taken its toll on the old operator. Alex learned that the approaching geomagnetic storm was crucial not just for signal propagation, but for the activation codes themselves. The mathematical sequences had been designed to synchronize with specific atmospheric conditions, using natural phenomena as an additional layer of security against unauthorized activation. Tomorrow's storm will create the precise conditions needed for final activation, Victor explained. The ionospheric disturbances will generate the electromagnetic signature that validates the activation codes. Without these natural conditions, the codes are mathematically meaningless. Victor's monitoring equipment showed that the storm was intensifying ahead of schedule, potentially creating the required activation window several hours earlier than originally planned. This timing change could provide a tactical advantage against the surveillance teams, who were presumably expecting transmission during the originally scheduled window. The activation codes revealed the true scope of Soviet ambition. During the Cold War, sleeper agents had been positioned not just for intelligence gathering, but for systematic disruption of Western society during global conflict. Infrastructure specialists, communications experts, and government officials who could paralyze entire regions during wartime activation. Many agents have risen to positions we never anticipated, Victor noted. Software engineers who helped design critical computer systems, defense contractors with access to military specifications, financial officers who could manipulate electronic markets. Their potential impact has grown far beyond original mission parameters. Victor showed Alex evidence that unauthorized activation attempts had been increasing in frequency and sophistication. Someone had acquired partial code sequences and was attempting to activate individual agents through trial and error methods. Several agents had been compromised when they responded to incorrect activation attempts. The mercenaries hunting us possess more than surveillance equipment, Victor realized. They have partial network intelligence, possibly obtained from captured operators. They are close to achieving unauthorized activation, which is why they need to intercept tomorrow's transmission. The true purpose of the final transmission became clear. Victor wasn't just communicating with surviving network nodes. He was implementing a coordinated shutdown that would simultaneously contact all remaining agents with extraction orders. The activation codes would be used not to awaken the network, but to safely dismantle it. This represents the end of the most successful intelligence operation in history, Victor said with quiet pride. But endings require the same precision as beginnings. These agents deserve to disappear safely rather than face capture by those who would exploit their sacrifice. Victor began preparing the shutdown sequence, arranging the activation codes in the precise order required for coordinated extraction. Tomorrow's transmission would mark not the culmination of the sleeper network, but its dignified conclusion. The attack began at sunset, precisely as the atmospheric storm reached optimal intensity for long-range transmission. Victor's perimeter sensors detected coordinated movement from multiple directions as professional operatives closed in on the radio station with military precision. 12 contacts, Victor reported, monitoring the defensive systems Alex hadn't known existed. Standard assault formation, suggesting former special operations personnel with extensive training in facility penetration. Alex watched through hidden cameras as figures in tactical gear moved through the forest, using night vision equipment and suppressed weapons. Their movements were coordinated through sophisticated communication systems, indicating a level of organization and funding that confirmed Victor's assessment about private military contractors. Victor activated the bunker's defensive capabilities, revealing the installation's true nature as a hardened military facility designed to survive hostile action. Steel blast doors sealed the entrances, while hidden weapon emplacements emerged from concealed positions around the station's perimeter. The Soviet-era weapons cache contained equipment that had been carefully maintained for exactly this scenario. AK-74 assault rifles, RPG launchers, and defensive mines that could turn the facility into an impregnable fortress. Victor moved through the armory with practiced efficiency, selecting weapons and ammunition for a prolonged engagement. The bunker was designed to withstand direct artillery bombardment, Victor explained, as explosions echoed from the entrance. These mercenaries have sophisticated equipment, but they lack the heavy weapons necessary to breach our defensive perimeter quickly. Alex found himself pressed into service as Victor's assistant, operating communication equipment while the old operator managed defensive systems. The radio station's design allowed one person to coordinate multiple defensive positions from the central control room, turning the facility into a technological fortress. The attackers' first assault focused on the main entrance, using shaped charges to breach the outer blast door. But Victor had anticipated this approach, activating defensive systems that channeled attackers into predetermined kill zones where automated weapons could engage them effectively. They are professionals, but they underestimate Soviet defensive engineering, Victor observed, as the assault stalled against the bunker's layered defenses. This facility was designed by men who understood that communication stations would become priority targets during global conflict. The storm outside provided unexpected tactical advantages. Lightning strikes interfered with the attackers' electronic equipment, while rain reduced visibility and made coordinated movement more difficult. Victor had timed his defensive preparations to exploit these natural conditions. Alex monitored the defensive perimeter through surveillance cameras, watching as the assault teams regrouped after their initial repulse. Several figures lay motionless in the approaches to the bunker, testament to the effectiveness of Victor's preparations and the lethal nature of the defensive systems. They will attempt to cut our power next, Victor predicted, indicating backup systems that would maintain critical functions even if external power was severed. The installation was designed for energy independence during extended siege conditions. Victor's tactical expertise became evident as he managed multiple defensive positions simultaneously. Automated weapon systems engaged targets based on his real-time commands, while electronic countermeasures disrupted the attackers' communication and coordination systems. The second assault came from an unexpected direction as the mercenaries attempted to access the facility through the ventilation system. But Victor had anticipated this approach as well, activating defensive measures that turned the air circulation network into a lethal maze for intruders. Soviet paranoia served a purpose. Victor commented grimly as automated defenses eliminated another infiltration attempt. Every possible attack vector was considered and countered during the original design phase. Alex realized that the attackers had made a critical miscalculation. They had expected to face an aging operator defending obsolete equipment, not a fully operational military installation with defensive capabilities that rivaled modern installations. Victor's decades of maintenance had kept every system in perfect working condition. The weapons cache revealed additional surprises, modern ammunition and equipment that had been acquired through channels Alex didn't want to contemplate. Victor had clearly maintained contact with sources who could provide contemporary military hardware to support his mission. The network's final transmission will proceed as planned, Victor declared as the third assault wave regrouped in the forest. These mercenaries can delay us, but they cannot prevent the completion of our mission. Victor began final preparations for the transmission sequence, activating equipment that would broadcast the shutdown codes regardless of the tactical situation outside. The atmospheric window was approaching, and nothing would prevent him from executing the network's final protocol. "Help me with the transmission parameters," Victor instructed Alex. "You understand the technical requirements, and I need someone to operate secondary systems while I manage the primary broadcast." Alex found himself becoming an active participant in the network's conclusion, operating equipment that would end one of the most successful intelligence operations in history. The irony wasn't lost on him. An accidental discovery had led to voluntary participation. In protecting secrets he had never meant to uncover, the geomagnetic storm reached peak intensity as the fourth assault wave regrouped in the forest, lightning illuminating the tactical positions where mercenaries prepared for what they clearly intended as their final push against the bunker. Victor activated emergency broadcast equipment that would allow him to transmit distress signals on international frequencies, calling for assistance from any government agency monitoring the region. "Mayday! Mayday!" Victor transmitted in English, Russian, and German. "Military installation under attack by unknown forces. Request immediate assistance from any monitoring station." Coordinates follow. The emergency broadcasts went out on frequencies monitored by NATO early warning systems, Russian military communications, and international aviation authorities. Within minutes, responses began arriving from military installations across Europe, indicating that Victor's distress call had been received and was being processed. Through official channels, Alex operated the secondary communication equipment while Victor coordinated both defensive operations and transmission preparations. The storm provided perfect cover for their emergency broadcasts, while simultaneously creating the atmospheric conditions necessary for the network's final protocol. Ukrainian military acknowledges distress call, Alex reported, monitoring response frequencies. Polish border patrol is requesting additional information. German air traffic control is advising aircraft to avoid this area. The lightning storm intensified, creating spectacular electrical displays that interfered with the attackers' night vision and electronic equipment. Victor had timed his operations to exploit these natural conditions, understanding that the same atmospheric disturbances that enabled long-range communication would also degrade hostile surveillance capabilities. The mercenaries' fourth assault was their most determined. Yet shaped charges breached secondary defensive positions, while assault teams advanced under covering fire from suppressed weapons. But Victor's defensive systems had been designed by engineers who understood modern warfare, and each breach was met with automated countermeasures They're adapting to our defensive pattern, Victor observed as explosions echoed through the bunker. Professional soldiers learn from tactical failures and adjust their approach accordingly. Alex watched through surveillance cameras as Victor proved his own combat credentials. Despite his advanced age, the old operator moved through the defensive positions with practiced efficiency, engaging targets with precision that spoke of extensive military training. This wasn't just a radio operator. This was a combat veteran defending his post. The emergency broadcast equipment allowed Victor to maintain contact with legitimate military authorities while fending off the mercenary assault. His tactical reports provided real-time intelligence about the attack, enabling government forces to understand the nature of the threat and respond appropriately. Russian helicopter patrol reports inbound, estimated arrival 20 minutes. Alex relayed from the communication equipment. Ukrainian border guards are mobilizing rapid response team. Polish special forces requesting permission to cross border. Victor smiled grimly as he realized that his emergency broadcasts were triggering an international incident that would soon overwhelm the mercenary operation. Multiple governments were now aware of the attack on a sensitive installation, and legitimate military forces were responding with overwhelming superiority. The attackers seemed to recognize that their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. The fifth assault was desperate and uncoordinated, suggesting that whoever commanded the mercenary operation understood that official military intervention would end their chances of acquiring network access. Victor took advantage of the attacker's desperation to begin the actual transmission sequence. The atmospheric window was optimal, the equipment was prepared, and the shutdown codes were ready for broadcast. Nothing would prevent the completion of Operation Nightingale's final protocol. Beginning primary transmission, Victor announced as he activated the main transmitter. All remaining network nodes, this is Nightingale 7 with final protocol authorization. The radio station's massive transmitter generated signals that propagated across continents, carrying shutdown codes that would simultaneously contact every surviving sleeper agent. Alex monitored the broadcast parameters, while Victor managed both the transmission and ongoing defensive operations. A powerful explosion rocked the bunker as the mercenaries made their final attempt to breach the facility. Emergency lighting activated as primary power fluctuated, but backup systems maintained critical operations. Victor continued the transmission sequence despite the tactical situation deteriorating around them. Secondary transmission complete, Alex reported. Network acknowledgements received from Prague and Bucharest. Shutdown protocol is being implemented across all remaining nodes. Victor smiled with satisfaction as decades of intelligence work reached its planned conclusion. The sleeper network that had survived the entire Cold War was finally being safely dismantled, its assets extracted before hostile forces could exploit their positions. A sniper's bullet shattered the control room window, and Victor staggered as the round caught him in the shoulder. Blood spread across his uniform, but he continued operating the transmission equipment with one hand, while Alex applied pressure to the wound. Final codes transmitted, Victor whispered. The network is ending as it should, with dignity and purpose. The sound of helicopters approaching from multiple directions filled the air outside, indicating that legitimate military forces were finally arriving to end the siege. Victor's wound was bleeding heavily, but he refused medical attention until the transmission sequence was complete. Alex applied pressure bandages, while the old operator continued monitoring network responses, ensuring that shutdown codes reached every surviving station before legitimate military forces arrived. "I have carried this burden for 40 years, Victor said quietly, his voice weak but determined. Every day, wondering if my sacrifice served any purpose, if the agents I protected would ever be safely brought home. Today, finally, I have my answer." Alex helped Victor to Elena's photograph, which the old operator had kept beside his equipment throughout the siege. Victor traced his finger over Dimitri's face. seeing in the young soldier's expression the same dedication that had sustained him through decades of isolation. "I never met Dmitri, but I inherited his mission and his loneliness," Victor continued. "For 40 years I have lived his life, maintained his post, carried his secrets. Perhaps now I can finally tell his sister that her brother's work is finished." Victor retrieved a sealed letter from his personal effects, an envelope he had carried for decades but never opened. Inside, Alex discovered Dmitri's final message, written before his death in 1963, addressed to whoever would continue his mission at Nightingale 7. The letter revealed Dmitri's profound understanding of the sacrifice required by their work. He had anticipated that his successor would face the same moral conflicts, the same isolation, the same burden of maintaining loyalty to a cause that might outlive the government that created it. "My successor," the letter began, "you will face choices that no training can prepare you for. You will maintain secrets that burden your soul and protect people you cannot contact. Remember that duty to those who trust us matters more than duty to those who command us." Victor's eyes filled with tears as he read his predecessor's words. Dmitri had understood that Operation Nightingale would continue long after the Cold War ended, sustained by operators who chose personal sacrifice over institutional loyalty. The letter contained specific instructions that Victor had never seen in official documentation. Dmitri had hidden emergency protocols within the station's systems, backup procedures that could be implemented if official command structure collapsed. Victor had unknowingly been following Dmitri's contingency plans for decades. He knew the Soviet Union would not survive, Victor realized. These instructions assume political collapse and provide guidance for independent operation. Dmitri planned for exactly the situation I have faced. The most moving section of the letter was Dmitri's personal message to his family. He had written detailed explanations for his absence, expressions of love that he could never send, and hopes that someday his sacrifice would be understood and forgiven. "Tell Elena that I kept my promise," Dmitri had written. "Tell her that her brother's work helped protect people who could not protect themselves. Tell her that exile from those we love is sometimes the price of keeping them safe." Victor showed Alex his own letter, one he had written but never sent to a daughter who believed he had died decades ago. The parallels between Victor's and Dmitri's sacrifices were heartbreaking. 2 generations of men who had chosen duty over family, mission over personal happiness. "I have a granddaughter I have never met," Victor confessed. "She would be about your age now. Sometimes I wonder if the world we protected was worth the families we abandoned." The sound of approaching helicopters grew louder as Ukrainian and Polish military forces established perimeters around the facility. Victor's emergency broadcasts had triggered coordinated responses from multiple governments, creating an international incident that would overshadow the mercenary operation. Victor began preparing final documentation that would explain the network's existence to government investigators. Detailed records of operations, agent identities, and mission parameters that would allow intelligence agencies to understand what they had discovered. "These files must reach proper authorities," Victor instructed Alex. "The agents who are being extracted deserve official recognition for their service, even if that recognition must remain classified." Victor's final act was to activate the station's self-destruct sequence, ensuring that sensitive equipment would be destroyed rather than fall into hostile hands. The facility that had operated in secret for 60 years would disappear with dignity, leaving only memories and carefully preserved records. "Operation Nightingale ends as it began," Victor said with quiet satisfaction, "with professionals making difficult choices to protect people who will never know their names." As Victor's strength faded, he pressed Elena's photograph into Alex's hands. "Tell her that Dmitri's successor kept faith with his memory. Tell her that her vigil is finally over and her brother's ghost can rest." The letter to Victor's daughter contained similar sentiments, explanations for a lifetime of absence, expressions of love that could never be shared directly, and hopes that his sacrifice had served some greater purpose than personal ambition. Victor's eyes closed as Ukrainian medics entered the bunker, but he was smiling. After 40 years of solitary duty, he had finally completed the mission that Dmitri had begun. Dawn broke through dissipating storm clouds as the final network transmission reached its crescendo. Victor, supported by Alex despite his wounds, activated the master shutdown sequence that would permanently end Operation Nightingale after 60 years of continuous operation. All stations. This is Nightingale 7, transmitting final protocol on authority. Gudslav, Victor 77. Victor spoke into the microphone with the formal precision of military procedure. Execute shutdown sequence Omega. Acknowledge receipt and implement immediate asset extraction. The responses came from the few surviving stations across Eastern Europe. Prague acknowledging, Bucharest confirming, and a weak signal from somewhere in the Baltic states indicating that one more operator had maintained his lonely vigil through the decades of political upheaval. Alex monitored the technical parameters while Victor transmitted the master shutdown codes that had been prepared for this moment. Since the network's inception, mathematical sequences that would simultaneously contact every remaining sleeper agent with extraction orders, ending their decades-long missions and allowing them to disappear safely. The facility shook as Ukrainian special forces breached the outer perimeter, engaging the remaining mercenaries in a final firefight that echoed through the forest. Professional military forces with heavy weapons quickly overwhelmed the private contractors, whose sophisticated equipment proved inadequate against legitimate army units. Transmission complete, Alex reported, as the final code sequence went out across multiple frequencies. All network nodes have acknowledged receipt and are implementing coordinated shutdown. Victor smiled with profound satisfaction as decades of careful planning reached its intended conclusion. Across Europe and North America, sleeper agents would be receiving their final instructions, not to activate for some desperate mission, but to safely extract from positions they had maintained through lifetimes of dedication. The mercenaries' final assault came as Victor activated the station's self-destruct sequence. Shaped charges positioned throughout the facility would destroy sensitive equipment while preserving the historical records that intelligence agencies would need to understand what they had discovered. 30 seconds to destruction, Victor announced over the facility's communication system. All personnel evacuate immediately. This is not a drill. Alex helped Victor toward the emergency exit as explosive charges began detonating in sequence. The radio equipment that had maintained contact with agents across the globe disappeared in controlled explosions that turned sophisticated electronics into unrecognizable debris. Victor insisted on carrying Dmitri's photograph and the sealed letters that represented the human cost of the network's operation. These personal artifacts would survive even if the facility itself was destroyed, preserving the memory of sacrifice that official records could never adequately document. The underground corridors filled with smoke and debris as they reached the emergency exit. Victor moved slowly, his wound limiting his mobility, but his determination remained unshaken. He would witness the network's end just as he had maintained its operation, with professional competence and personal dignity. Outside, Ukrainian forces had established a secure perimeter around the facility. The surviving mercenaries had been neutralized or captured, their sophisticated equipment confiscated by government forces who were beginning to understand the significance of what they had stumbled into. Alex helped Victor to a safe distance as the main charges detonated. The radio mast that had stood for 60 years collapsed in a controlled demolition that sent shockwaves through the forest. The facility that had operated in absolute secrecy was disappearing as thoroughly as the government that had created it. Nightingale 7, final transmission complete. Victor spoke into a portable radio, addressing any stations that might still be monitoring. Network shutdown implemented successfully. All operators may stand down with honor. Mission accomplished. The last responses came from stations that Alex hadn't known still existed. Brief acknowledgements from operators who had maintained their posts through the collapse of everything they had originally served. Their final transmissions carried the weight of shared understanding between professionals who had sacrificed everything for duty. Victor watched the destruction with mixed emotions, satisfaction that the mission had ended as planned, but sadness that 60 years of dedication was disappearing in flames and debris. The installation that had been his home and fortress was returning to the forest that had hidden it so effectively. Emergency medical teams reached Victor as the facility's destruction was completed. The old operator allowed himself to be placed on a stretcher, but insisted on maintaining radio contact until every surviving station had confirmed successful shutdown implementation. "The network is ended," Victor told Alex as medics worked on his wound. "The agents are safe, the secrets are protected, and the mission is complete." Sometimes the best ending is simply knowing when to stop. As helicopters lifted Victor toward medical treatment, Alex remained at the smoking ruins of the facility, holding the letters that represented the true cost of Cold War intelligence operations. Families abandoned, lives sacrificed, and personal happiness surrendered for causes that outlived the governments that had demanded such dedication. 1 week after the destruction of Nightingale 7, Alex returned to the site carrying a simple granite stone that he had commissioned from a local mason. The forest had already begun reclaiming the cleared area where the radio station had stood, with new growth emerging from soil, enriched by decades of careful stewardship. The stone bore a simple inscription in both English and Russian. "In memory of those who served in silence. 1961-2025, their sacrifice is not forgotten." Below the text, Alex had added the coordinates of the facility and a small engraving of radio waves propagating across the globe. Elena waited for him at the memorial site, her weathered hands holding fresh wildflowers that she had gathered from the meadows around her cottage. At 83, she moved slowly but with purpose, finally able to perform the ritual she had been denied for 60 years. "Dmitri would have approved," Elena said, as Alex positioned the memorial stone where the radio mast had once stood. "He always said that the best monuments are the ones that remember service rather than victory." Alex had spent the week in extensive debriefings with multiple intelligence agencies, providing detailed accounts of the network's final operation. Ukrainian, Polish, Russian, and American officials had all interviewed him, seeking to understand the scope of the intelligence operation that had functioned in secret for 6 decades. The official reports would remain classified for decades, but Alex had been authorized to share basic information with Elena, confirmation that her brother's work had been completed successfully and that his sacrifice had served its intended purpose. The vigil that had sustained her for 60 years could finally end. Victor had survived his wounds and was recovering in a military hospital outside Kiev. Government officials from multiple countries were negotiating his future, recognizing that he possessed historical knowledge that could fill significant gaps in Cold War intelligence records. His cooperation would likely result in comfortable retirement rather than prosecution. The network's shutdown had proceeded exactly as Victor had planned. Across Europe and North America, sleeper agents had received their extraction orders and disappeared into new identities provided by intelligence agencies who recognized their decades of service. Most would never be publicly acknowledged, but they would be cared for by the same governments they had once been positioned to undermine. Elena shared news that the abandoned village of Kosnica was being considered for historical preservation. The perfectly preserved Cold War-era buildings represented a unique glimpse into a world that had vanished with the Berlin Wall's fall. Elena would finally have neighbors again, as researchers and historians studied the community that had been frozen in time. The government men who came asking questions were different this time, Elena told Alex. Polite, respectful, interested in preserving rather than destroying. They want to honor what happened here, rather than pretend it never existed. Alex had delivered Victor's message to Elena, along with the photograph of her brother and Dimitri's final letter. Elena had wept reading her brother's words, finally understanding that his absence had been motivated by love rather than abandonment. The letter provided the closure she had sought for 60 years. The memorial stone would mark not just the location of a secret facility, but the end of an era when global conflict required such profound personal sacrifices. The Cold War's conclusion had been officially declared decades earlier, but Operation Nightingale's shutdown represented the true end of that ideological struggle. Alex planned to return annually to maintain the memorial, ensuring that Victor and Dimitri's story would not be forgotten, even if it could never be fully told. The stone would weather naturally, becoming part of the forest landscape that had hidden so many secrets for so long. Elena placed her flowers at the base of the memorial, finally able to perform the mourning ritual that had been denied her since 1962. Her brother was not buried here, but his spirit had found peace with the completion of his mission and the recognition of his sacrifice. As they prepared to leave, Elena pressed a small key into Alex's hand, the same key that Dimitri had given her before the evacuation. "This belongs with you now," she said. "You understand what it represents." Alex accepted the key as a symbol of responsibility to preserve the memory of those who had served in silence. Their stories might never be publicly told, but they would not be forgotten by those who understood the true cost of duty. The forest around the memorial site was quiet except for the wind, through pine trees and the distant sound of Elena's footsteps, as she walked home to a cottage that would no longer echo with solitary waiting. The ghosts that had haunted the Carpathian wilderness for 60 years could finally rest.